welcome to the Geneva Center for Security Policy. Welcome to the IHL Talks, and welcome to the special, I want to say tribunal, but it's not the tribunal, the special panel on Libya. It's a pleasure to see you all here, and to spend this evening together to discuss and explore some pressing challenges related to security law. And it's an honor to host the IHL Talks here tonight at GCSP, and I thank the leadership of the Geneva Academy for co-organizing this event here with us at GCSP. And I also thank you, Anissa, who you were really the main driver behind these, of these IHL Talks, and it's really a pleasure to have you here. And as you all know, Anissa Belal, she's also a true, or really one of the true authorities in town when it comes to international humanitarian law, human rights, and especially if you want to talk the complicated things about non-state actors. Mrs. Anissa Belal, Dr. Anissa Belal, is Strategic Advisor on International Humanitarian Law and Research Fellow at Geneva Academy. She's also a Senior Lecturer at Sciences Po Paris. She worked for Geneva Hall, for the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, for the Swiss Department of Foreign Affairs, for the IHRC, and now I'm just going to stop because we're going to spend the whole evening on that. So thank you very much. Thank you for co-organizing this event, for putting such great people together. Looking very much forward to the discussions, and with that I would like to give you the word to talk more about the IHL Talks and about the panelists in our discussions tonight. So again, welcome to GCSP. Enjoy. Let's have fun.
Yes, I'm not sure how.
Mine didn't work, so I took yours.
Okay. Thank you, Tobias. So you make me blush a little bit, I have to say. So thank you very much for the very kind introduction. In the name of the Geneva Academy and of his director who is here, he agreed that I say a few names in the name of the Academy. So thank you very much for hosting us for the GCSP. We were very keen on having this collaboration with the GCSP on this particular topic, which is Libya. And just a few words about the IHL Talks. Those are events that we are organizing at the Academy on current issues related to international humanitarian law, but that are not strictly aimed at the legalistic public. We wanted to be open to a broader discussion, policy discussion, political discussions, and of course also including legal discussions. We had four panels so far. One of them was on migration, the other one on healthcare, a third one on counterterrorism, one on the protection of cultural property in our conflict, and this one on Libya. All those are posted on our website, on our YouTube channel, so they are all available online. You can see them if you want. Tonight as well, it will be posted on our website. So those are public discussions. We are not under Chatham House rule, so that we are also aware of this. With this, I will introduce the panelists. Perhaps not all of them, not both of them now. I will start with Elham, which will open this discussion today, and then I will give you the floor, Jean-Paul. So both Elham and Jean-Paul have very impressive CVs, so I won't be able to tell you everything that they have done. But Elham is the Director of Lawyers for Justice in Libya, which is an NGO that she co-founded following the country's 2011 uprising. Elham's work includes fact-finding and documentation of evidence and strategic litigation before a range of international mechanisms, including with regard to the ICC cases related to Muammar Gaddafi, Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, and Abdullah al-Sanusi. The Lawyers for Justice in Libya organization has been monitoring the migration crisis in Libya, and I think you might be able to tell us a little bit about this today. The organization has been monitoring the conditions in detention, exploitation, and developments also with regard to European policy. Elham is a practicing lawyer. She holds an LLM in international law with distinction from SOAS University. She practices at Slaughter and May and she practiced, and is currently an associate fellow of the International Law Program at Chatham House. So the floor is yours, Elham. But perhaps I will open and give you the floor by asking you a question. Well, the situation in Libya is very complicated. I have to say that I've read reports and the academy also within the war report we have done a description of the situation, but it's quite confusing with all the actors and the developments. So perhaps you could start by giving us an overview of the political and legal situation in the country, if you would like to.
Well, of course, first of all, I want to thank everyone who showed up in the conditions outside. I feel like an extra duty of care to you now because of that. So I'll make sure that I don't take too long so that I can answer as many questions as possible. But in terms of trying to set the scene, I think Libya is sort of the country of many governments and no state. Is probably the best way to describe it. So we, at the moment, we have 3 governments that are vying for legitimacy or power. None of them are legally constituted. So as a lawyer's perspective, it's always very tricky to deal with that scenario. The first is the government that came out of the General National Council, which was the first elected parliament in Libya, and its mandate ended legally at the end of, in the summer of 2014, but it refused to step down. We held an election nonetheless, and elected a new parliament, which formed a new government. So within a couple of months of that election, the Supreme Court of Libya declared that it was illegitimate, but they continued. And even if you were to deem them legitimate, their mandate also ended about a year ago, but they still continue. And then we have the compromised government of national accord, which is the UN-mandated body, which is intended to be a compromise of both those governments to get them to finally step down. But it's not legitimate either, because a key element of it becoming legal under Libyan law is for it to be approved by the House of Representatives, which is the parliament, the second parliament. And that parliament hasn't approved it yet. So legally, technically, none of them are legitimate. The way that's panned out in practice is that effectively they split up the country and they have different parts that they have influence over. And I think it's worth thinking for a moment about how this pans out in the bigger picture, because you have the Government of National Accord, the GNA, which is recognized by the international community as the counterpart. You have a UN Security Resolution 2259 that says that's who we should interact with and that it should be supported without it being legitimate in the country. And I think as a question to put out there for people to consider is what that does to the rule of law in Libya when you have a very clearly sort of not legally constituted government being recognized as a counterpart by states. I'll come to that practical problem when we talk about the migration crisis in a little bit, and how that manifests itself on the ground. Aside from their legal structure, practically they're also not legitimate. They have very little popular support, other than in the very small vicinity in which they operate. And there is a very minimal popular mandate to any of these 3 states. So I think there is this sort of legal issues, but then there's the practical issues, and then who controls on the ground. And I think the answer to that is that there are several non-state armed actors who very much control the situation on the ground, which I'll come to in a moment. So we have the Government of National Accord, which was set up through this Libyan political process and the Libyan political agreement, which is a conciliatory document and a very problematic one. It's problematic in the process that it happened because the key actors really on Libya, the armed groups, whether they are non-state or quasi-state, because they've been legitimized by a parliament, so I'm talking about the Libyan National Army, quote-unquote, which is now purported to be the official army of Libya by the I almost feel like I need a diagram to draw this for it to make sense, like on a whiteboard. So if you look at Libya, in the west you have the GNC, and its small government. And the GNA also shares a space there. So the UN mandated one and the very first government are vying for power there, and it depends on which week you visit Libya that you can get a sense of who's in control. Then in the east you have the House of Representatives government very much in control with the support of the Libyan National Army under the guidance of General Khalifa Haftar, who is a very key player in the picture. So when you come look at the political agreement and how we got this government of national accord, key actors weren't part of that. So the armed groups, Haftar, but also actually a lot of the local level leaders who have the influence on the ground. And so it's an agreement that was brokered, but with no one who can influence its outcome on the ground. And I think that's a fundamental problem that we've seen. It also, from a legal perspective, has very little conditionality on who takes part, who becomes part of a government from the perspective of accountability for human rights violations or international crimes. And so there is no vetting process really for who becomes involved in the process. And when you think of the power of the militias in affecting the day-to-day lives, and you can start to get a feel of why that's not the case. And then there's also sort of there's no conditionality on what needs to happen before the next election takes place from the perspective of key milestones. It's all driven by the need to have an election soon. And the reason I want to pinpoint that is in Libya there seems to be a problem where whenever there's a problem, just have an election. It's sort of going, from 42 years of dictatorship to a festival of democracy, in quotation marks. But every election we've had has had a lower turnout with much smaller mandates and with key demographics being left out, either because physically they can't get to the polls because they've been disenfranchised politically, or because it's just not safe to them because of the militias on the ground trying to stop people voting. So with every attempt at legitimacy with the new government, actually what you're achieving is less because fewer people turn out to vote. And what we're seeing now is the international community really pushing to gain a new legitimacy by pushing for the constitutional process to be put in place so that we can have a new government with a presidential structure in place. And for me and for my NGO, we think that that's probably the most dangerous step that the international community is pushing for, because if you look at the situation in Libya and how deteriorated the rule of law has become, because every law that's been passed has been undermined by militias and by the situation on the ground. To bring your constitutional process into that framework, you're effectively taking the most vital document from a legal perspective for Libya's future and putting it in a situation where it can only fail. And I think in that scenario, actually, it's almost putting the cart before the horse. It's trying to use the constitution to achieve the transitional justice process effectively, where in reality, all the constitution can do is reflect what's going on in the country. It can't change it, really. And there's so much influence being put on that. And the process for drafting the constitution has been fundamentally flawed. The key minorities have not been part of it, whether out of their own opting out of the process because of it or because they've been physically disenfranchised. It has been not consultative of the population. It has not been in any way transparent. The drafts of the constitution, of which we've had over 8 now, are leaked onto Facebook instead of shared with the public. And we're now talking about a referendum in the coming months because the international community wants a solution where the draft that's being circulated is not official. There's people on the drafting committee themselves are like, not sure that's the draft. When you ask them, they go, I think it was a different one. Because it's just no agreement on it. And if you ignore all that and then look at the draft and pretend that the process was fine, the draft is fundamentally problematic because the way it defines Libyan nationality, the way it defines the Libyan state, the way it sets out the future government structure are really problematic from an inclusive perspective or from in any way unifying. It defines Libya as an Arab state, and obviously in Libya we have minorities that aren't Arab. It defines Libya as a Muslim state, and there are minorities who aren't Muslim. And it also fundamentally undermines the women's rights by including very strict citizenship provisions on women and women who marry foreigners. And so I think fundamentally it is a really problematic document. And if the international community keeps pushing to get that as a solution because they need an election, it seems that we're setting ourselves up for a really big failure. So if there's one thing to take away, and if there are any influences in this room from a sort of state body, then please let that be my plea, that this is not the solution to enshrine what is currently the problem. But I think, so that's the sort of political framework. And the legal framework, I guess we take a little bit of responsibility for, because the National Transitional Council, which was the very first government that came into play during the revolution when it started, so the ones who stepped in to take us to the first election, was full of lawyers. So their solution to everything was to draft a law, but without any mechanism to enforce that law, or to hold people accountable for breaching that law. And so there's become this really odd process of really just a flood of legislation that is quickly drafted, very badly drafted, very contradictory to existing legislation, and when it then ends up inevitably either ignored because no one understands it, no one cares, or if the few instances where it really matters and it ends up in the courts, the judiciary is not really empowered to do very much. The one glimmer of hope we've had in Libya on that process is that the Supreme Court has actually taken some very brave decisions in the last 5 years. And at one point, when they were trying to take a decision that was very controversial politically, it was about the legitimacy of one of the governments, they decided, and they were being held physically hostage by a militia to decide on it. So the militia actually stormed the Supreme Court and held the judges sort of hostage until they took the right decision. The judges actually declared that the judiciary was suspended in Libya. And so they didn't take the decision. So for us, they're kind of potentially our heroes, which is always exciting as a lawyer to find some legal hero. But I think that's sort of the framework kind of legally, and when we, I guess, talk about some of the obstacles we've seen with the armed groups, I don't know if that's what you were going to ask me.
Yes, but please do.
I think, so that's the framework. We have governments that have no control, that have no say, but have still an income that's decent, and a central bank that's split. So each government has its own central bank, incidentally. Same bank, but it's different governors taking different decisions. And different countries recognize different governors. So it's very strange when you go to a conference and the governor of the central bank is there, but you don't know which one is it going to be this time. You can get an idea of which governments are and countries are supporting which side in the conflict by who they invite to speak from the central bank. It's a very good indicator. So the central bank's position is we're not involved in this conflict. We are a neutral entity that is there for purely practical purposes, to pay salaries, to cover costs. What that means is that they've paid salaries effectively to all the militias. So if you fought in the conflict in 2011, you could sign up as a fighter, and once you sign up as a fighter, you get a salary. And increasingly, people keep signed up as fighters because A, it was really good pay, and B, no one vetted them because actually, if you said no to them, they had more power than you, and so they could come and take the central bank from you, or they would send troops in. And so what we end up now having in the country of about 6 million is we have, as of 2014, there's been, as far as I can tell, no new list published, but as of 2014, there is over 200,000 people registered as fighters, taking salaries. If you take a moment, think the average salary of a fighter is about 3 to 4 times what an average Libyan gets. So it's a very lucrative business. There is zero incentive for peace. You're making far more money as a fighter than you are as a citizen. Add to that, that there is no vetting. So anyone who wants to can, and in fact people go and sign up 10, 15, 100 people saying that that's their troop. And some of the lists that we've seen, the people are dead, or they are 12 years old or 5 years old because they just put every name down and there's no vetting of those people. So some of the multi-millionaires that have appeared in Libya are because they're a group of 3 or 4 who've put down an army of 3,000 and taking the salaries for those people. So the corruption is astounding. But if people ask me how to describe the sort of militia situation in Libya, I'll say, or the civil war in Libya, I'll say I think it's the first subsidized civil war in history. Because the government is paying everyone to fight each other. And until someone just cuts them off, there's absolutely no incentive to do it themselves, and they won't come to the table. Because for now, they all are getting paid to think that they can win the war. So I think it's yeah, so that's just to put it out there. And legally, the way amnesties have been used, actually, oddly, and I think in the last panel people were talking about amnesties as an indication of an end of a conflict. I think in Libya, it's actually an indicator of the start of the conflict, because back in 2011, 2012, there was a law issued that included a forward-looking amnesty, which I think is also a first. So it provided an amnesty for anything done in the name of the 17th of February Revolution. So as long as you could justify your actions as being in the name of the revolution, you had an amnesty looking forward. So in fact, it's not an amnesty, it's a blanket impunity for the fighters. And so what you get is a lot of them always, regardless of which side they're on, they're always talking about being, doing this to preserve the February 17th revolution. And there's lots of laws around that also sort of support that prospect, where it's a criminal offense to negatively talk about the revolution in the media. You can't criticize the revolution, etc. All those feed into a situation where everyone is silent and the militias are in control. But we also have, obviously, amnesties included as part of the LPA, the Libyan political agreement that are being discussed, including potentially for the Libyan National Army, which again it sounds much grander than it is. It's effectively a group of militias with very good branding. And then also the House of Representatives issued an amnesty for the old regime, the Gaddafi regime, under which the claim that it's safe Islam, Gaddafi was released last month, is under this amnesty. That is indeed the case. And I think the biggest danger of obviously these amnesties and the prospect of always justifying it by this revolution or by your intention as opposed to your action, is that you have created an entire culture of impunity in Libya, and it makes the work of lawyers, the work of judges, everyone very difficult, and it makes indeed, again, going back to the constitutional point, the environment in which you talk about a constitution and how you would then hold people accountable or vet them for future processes really non-existent. But I think I guess the practical impediment as well to any kind of accountability is the fact that the government themselves are reliant on the militias for their own survival. And so when the government of National Court entered Libya, it was because the main militia in Tripoli invited them in from Tunisia and gave them security. So all it takes is for that militia to turn on them and they're back out being a government in exile again. And that's very much understood by these governments. And so it's not the governments propping up the militias, and that's what I think people seem to think it is. It's more the central bank funding the militias, partly, and then the militias propping up the governments, and not the other way around. But I think for me that's a really, I don't know how much that helps sort of clear the fog, but I'll pick up questions specifically. But it's really important to think of that in the big picture, because an example of how the militias prop up the governments and not the other way around, or how there's very little control over them. So Saif is a very clear example. He's been detained by a militia in Zintan for the last 5 years. Because none of the governments could ever get physical control of him, what was created was that the Attorney General in Libya created this mandate where they created a paper trail officially of saying, oh, no, we've asked the militia in Zintan to hold him because that's out of Tripoli and it's safer and there might be reprisals in Tripoli, and so this is fine, we have control of the situation. And then now when the militia decided unilaterally to release them, the Attorney General has been saying, no, you can't release him because I haven't approved that. That's not sort of a state-mandated decision. And the Attorney General is trying really hard to discuss this with the militia, which is like, no problem, we're done with it, we don't want him anymore. And we're following the House of Representatives' decision. And so it was a really clear example of how there is no control. The other obvious example is the Libyan National Army, which was created by ex-army officers, some police officers, and some militiamen, and Haftar took over. And when he became powerful enough, then the House of Representatives appointed him as head of the chief of staff, chief of armed forces, and gave him a title to legitimize him instead of actually creating that function. And so it's very much led from the armed forces backwards and then getting legitimacy that way. So I think I'll leave it there, and then maybe I can pick up later about how that impacts on things like migration and other state functions that are important.
I have still two questions for you with regard to this. First of all, can you tell us a little bit about the impact of other states in the conflict? Like, I think there are many states not necessarily intervening, but at least being interested in what is going on in Libya. And by the way, I forgot to tell you that in the red folder for those who attended the conference, there is a short description of the Libyan conflict, and you can find it also outside, where you also have a description of all the parties to the conflict, including the different states which are implicated in this conflict. So that would be my first question. And the second question, how is then your organization working in this condition? Who are your interlocutors? How can you, in fact, ensure that you have, how can you ensure working in those kind of conditions?
So, yeah, so the third countries question is always an interesting one in the Libyan situation, because from day one, the Libyan revolution was very much involved. So it had the international community involved in it. So, Libya as a state went and requested intervention from the Security Council itself. It wasn't it wasn't even a consent, it was an appeal, actually, to get intervention. And as an NGO and as Libyans, we did call for that, because at that time that was really the only hope. And so the involvement of international actors in Libya has been the case from the start. What's happening now is there's a sort of official support from states that's known, and then there's the kind of rumored support by states that is up for gossiping and debate. So, what we know about and what's official is the link between Haftar and the Libyan National Army and the House of Representatives in Egypt, which makes, so they're the ones based in the east, so they're on the Egyptian border. So it makes very clear sense why Egypt has a stake, because that is the border that is of interest to them, and Egypt's involvement was, very much enhanced after the ISIS involvement of killing the Coptic Egyptian workers in Libya. And so there are very clear reasons why Egypt is involved, but there's also a very clear relationship between Sisi and Haftar, and Haftar very much models himself on Sisi. Oh, this is public. Okay. So there goes that one. I think so. That's an understandable one, and it's accepted. And Egypt is very much involved in the air raids in Libya, together with the Libyan National Army, and it's publicly verifiable. We also know that France has accepted that it was physically present, because some of its soldiers were captured, and so it had to take responsibility that they were physically there. The U.S. has obviously also conducted some air raids recently in Sirte on ISIS targets, so they're involved in it as well. And then I guess those are sort of the official actors. And we could have a large debate about the element of consent that we were discussing earlier here, because there are elements of invitation by certain parties to be involved, and others saying we don't know anything about this. And so whether it becomes an international, non-international armed conflict is a great academic debate that I'm sure we can discuss over dinner at some point. But it's also, it comes back to the players of who the governments are and who's speaking to whom in the international community, and who's consenting for what or to what. The sort of unspoken actors are many, and I wouldn't sort of publicly say who they are, but Libya has also chosen, or one of the Libyan governments has also chosen to boycott Qatar recently, so you can read into that what you will. And there's also the UAE is also been sort of implicated because of their link with Egypt on this issue. But I think for me that's really interesting as a discussion and as a conversation, or as a sort of academic study of what makes this conflict interesting. But I think, practically speaking, it really is minimal. Because I think the militias are now self-sustaining to a large degree, whether it's through smuggling activities, or whether it's through trafficking or whether through their salaries, that the sort of impact of the international actors is interesting, and obviously in some areas it is vital, including the CERT side of things, but I don't think it's as big as people think it is, and I think it's dangerous to put too much light on that, because the solution needs to be also local from my perspective. If you think the solution is always international, then you're going to miss a lot of the undercurrent conflict that exists in Libya, which are really historic and very territorial and very tribal and have nothing to do with the international scene. The other question was about how we do our work. So in a way, it's quite liberating not to have a state to deal with. Because as a lot of my friends who work on like the Egyptian file find, you know, if you have a very clear state that you're dealing with, that's also can be very difficult for the work you do as an NGO. What we find we've changed the way we do our work. So in the initial phases of the revolution, a lot of what we were doing was about discussing things with the transitional government, with trying to support their initiatives, whether that's on transitional justice or accountability. But recently, actually, what we found is a lot of the problems in Libya stem from the history of what we've been through and our lack of really genuinely understanding what our rights are and how that works. So as a way of example, we did a very big study across the country as part of our organization, where we visited 37 communities on a bus tour, where we actually stopped and talked to people all the way along and talked to them about what their aspirations and constitutional wishes are. And we interviewed and surveyed over 3,000 people, which is a very high proportion for statistical purposes in a very small country like Libya. And what was one of the most disturbing facts that came out to me is in the population, and sort of in that segment, over 67% believe that torture was justifiable. And so what we're dealing with here is such a fundamental need for education on every level. So whether it's your state actors, or we talked about the last session about obligations versus rights. Actually, in Libya, you really need to do the rights education as well as the obligations, right? So the way we work is we say, when we talk about advocacy and who we talk to as a state, well, we say, well, great. If 3 governments want to pretend that they're the state, we'll talk to all of them. And for me, I'm addressing the state, and that will exist regardless if there is a government or not. And so when I'm going to the UN Human Rights Council, or whether I'm going to the African Commission to file a case, I'm filing against the state. I'm not filing it against the government. And governments are meant to go and come and cease to exist, but the states are the ones that continue to be liable. So for my purposes, in terms of advocacy, in terms of strategic litigation, which is what we do a lot of our work on, it's really not relevant who the government is. Where it matters is very much on the sort of very local advocacy perspective, or trying to do cases at a local level, because that system is very politicized. So what we do in country is very much grassroots and focusing on empowering people and educating, and also a lot of documenting and just keeping track of what's going on, because what we found is there's so many violations going on that if all we do is just document them for now, then that is a big job in itself. And then, when and if the time comes, you're ready to take it forward. So one of the initiatives we started is actually a national archive of violations. And so where people can submit to us any evidence they have, and we keep it safe until such time that we can hand it over to a transitional justice mechanism. But we also spend time educating people, reaching out to schools, reaching out to communities about what they should be doing, and about the constitutional process now especially. And so a lot of our efforts now is to explain to people why it's dangerous to accept the constitution in this environment. So we'll be launching a very strong no campaign. There's a referendum coming up. But in terms of trying to find someone to speak to, I'll speak to whoever wants to speak to me. But really, none of the governments will change anything in the ground. So it's for a small organization like ours, it's not really worth our time. We'll do the formal stuff here. We'll do the formal stuff in New York, because you need to go through those steps. But what's more interesting as a question is whether we should engage with militias. And for us, that's always been a really difficult one, because there's so many that even if you say I'm going to speak to everyone, who you chose to speak to first or who you choose to work with first will implicate you in the conflict and might make it very difficult for you to do something in another region or in another area. And so it's something that we struggled, and I would open anyone who has advice on how we can do this well. I'd be really grateful, because it's one of the things that we struggle with the most is we know that there needs to be engagement with armed groups, but how and who and what implications that will have on those doing the work and how that will place us, because the one thing we've done so far is everyone wants us out and everyone hates us, which means we must be doing something right, because everyone thinks we work for the other side. So whenever we put out a report, people say, oh, they're the agents of this side, and then the other side will say they're the agents of that side. And so in a way we're like, well, either we're really bad at our job because we don't know what we're doing, or we're doing something right if everyone's pissed off with us. I'm hoping it's the latter. I think that's the biggest struggle, is how you do that, and what implications that might have, and whether actually in reality you might do more harm than good for the overall cause that you're trying to achieve if you don't do it right. So that's the question I have for people. That's the one for which I have an answer.
No, it's a very good point, I think. So perhaps you can also talk to us a little bit about your work on migrants.
Microphones.
Yeah, thank you. On migrants, so what is your organization doing with regard to monitoring the rights of migrants?
Do I need a microphone as well?
We can hear you much better.
Okay, because I prefer not to. I feel it's much more intimate, so I'll speak a bit louder if not, but if you can't, please tell me and I can go louder, so don't worry.
Good. Good.
Yeah, so for me, I think the migrant crisis is a very good case study of Libya's conflict and its impact on its neighbors. So people always want to know about third parties' influence on Libya, but actually I think what's also interesting is Libya's impact on third countries. So whether you're looking at forms of smuggling drugs or arms, which is happening a lot out of Libya into third countries. I can't remember the exact figure, but I think they found that Libyan weapons were found in over 30 African countries at post-conflict, and so there is definitely that happening, which makes sense because there were a lot of weapons in Libya during the Gaddafi era and post-Gaddafi as well. Actually, I think there is, it's got one of the highest weapons per capita of anywhere. And also, the other thing we obviously have exported in some ways to neighbors is the training of fighters for other causes. And so I think that's sort of where we've had an impact. But I think one of the obviously most dramatic impacts is in the migration crisis. And it's helpful to go a little bit to before the conflict and what that looked like before this conflict to understand how this conflict has impacted on it. So actually pre-2011, most of the migrants that came to Libya was their end destination. They weren't planning to go on to Europe. And so if you look at the figures of how many people stayed in Libya, in 2011 to actually 2014, the number is anywhere between 1.3 million to 1.7 million would settle in Libya. That was their end destination. And those people coming into Libya, according to UNHCR, it's 5% or less were people who had an asylum claim. So they were what Europe and everyone says is sort of economic migrants. And Libya was the destination, and that's kind of how it was. What's happened since the conflict is that actually the length of stay in Libya has reduced massively to several weeks or several months because it's no longer the end destination. And we're seeing the numbers settling at around the 700,000 mark instead of the 1.7 million mark. And I think that explains a lot of the increase. And so when people talk to me about the migration crisis and the pull of Europe, our position is very much actually, as much as there might be a pull into Europe, there's very much a push out of Libya now, and that's because of the conditions in which migrants are finding themselves in Libya. And I think that can be attributed to several things. Obviously, key amongst them is the conflict. But the detention centers, or the reception centers, as the Italians like to call them, makes it sound better if you're receiving someone and if you're detaining them. It's very good branding. Are appalling. We have yet to meet someone who's been through a detention center in Libya who has not been tortured. Not one of the migrants we've spoken to has not been tortured in those centers. One of the most disturbing statistics I heard from women that we interviewed was part of the package of the traffickers now, as they enter Libya, is to give the women, as part of their payment, birth control because they will get raped on the journey, and so it minimizes them getting pregnant. And so part of your traffic package includes that now. So the people arrive at these detention centers, and if you, aside from the appalling sanitary conditions and medical facilities that are available, the overcrowding, there is no legal process at all. There's no registration of people entering these centers. We have no idea who's there, where they're from, what their names are, nothing, no details. They have no legal process. They don't appear before a judge. There's no legal counsel. There's no contact with families. All the basic rights are not there. And Libya is not a party to any refugee convention, or the refugee convention, or any policies. A couple on smuggling and trafficking, but not the refugee convention. In fact, in Libya, there is no definition in Libyan law for refugee, asylum seeker, anything like that. The only definition is for irregular entry, which is actually under Libyan law a criminal offense, and is punishable by prison with forced labor. And so, if you're caught, that's where you go to, or you go into a detention center. So, if you look at the UNHCR statistics again, it says that people coming through Libya now, 45% would qualify for some form of refugee status under European standards. And actually, our position as an organization is if you entered Libya, no matter how you entered, whether as an economic migrant or any status, by the time you've left, you've got a right to asylum for what you've been through in Libya. And that's kind of our official advocacy position. So with that backdrop, and with, we have lots of statistics, but I don't want to bore you with numbers because I think you reduce the plot a little bit if we get too much into the numbers. But I can share them with you. Under that background, let's look at what has been happening recently. So we have a memorandum of understanding that was entered into between Libya and Italy about the migration situation, in which the Italians offer Libya quite a significant amount of money, I think under this one agreement over 200 million, to help with the situation. And so in exchange for the money, Italy provides in theory, some medical supplies and medical support and training for the Libyan Coast Guard to then take on search and rescue operations. The Libyan Coast Guard, like any other security operation in Libya, is not vetted. There is no criteria to join it. And there is no training on human rights, there's no training on IHL, there's nothing. And in fact, just a few weeks ago, they opened fire on migrants because they couldn't control them. Italy, who's been held twice by the European Court of Human Rights to be in breach of its duties not to push back migrants to Libya, because they can't do that for a third time, have instead under this memorandum of understanding effectively outsourced that job to the Libyan Coast Guard. And so they say, we can't do it anymore, but you know what, you go get them, and we'll pay you for that, and we'll train you for that. And that is fundamentally problematic because even the UNHCR has said that Libya is no longer a safe third country. And so and this was before the memorandum of understanding was entered into by Italy and Libya and endorsed by the EU under the Malta Declaration. And so you have a situation where you've got the main body on refugee rights saying this is Libya, you cannot send people back to Libya, with European states signing up to send people back to Libya and paying Libya to do it. And for us, this is a really huge problem, and we think that what should be really looked at is obviously what Libya is doing, but also the responsibility of countries like Italy and the EU for endorsing that agreement in sending migrants back to a country that's not a part of the Refugee Convention, where there's documentary evidence that there is torture, where you've been told that it's not a safe country, and what's worse is they don't just send them back and train the Coast Guard, they are funding these reception facilities where the torture is being conducted. And so, in my mind, if you pay for it, you're responsible for it. And, there needs to be some kind of accountability, not just for the Libyan actors, but for those funding those facilities. And so, I'll put that out to you guys.
Just one question. When you say Italy and Libya, who is Libya?
Very good question. And I'm glad you asked that. So they signed the agreement with the Government of National Accord, which is the UN recognized counterpart. And that's really a really good question, because when that agreement was signed, a group of very prominent Libyan lawyers took a case against the GNA saying that they are not authorized to sign that agreement because they're not legitimately constituted as a government. A. B, even if they were, it would be within their mandate as a transitional government to sign long-term agreements of this nature. They would be only required to sign agreements that are relevant to the transitional period. But what's really interesting within the case is a really detailed explanation of all the reasons why this is also problematic and why it shouldn't be held up by a court. Key amongst them was that Libya is not able to cope with this. Libya doesn't have a human rights record to cope with this. There's violations that are going to occur. But also, interestingly, they made a case within it is that Libya is xenophobic. And the migrants that are coming are black African migrants, and that Libyans traditionally have racism issues, but this was increased post the conflict because of the rumors that came around that the Gaddafi was using African mercenaries to fight Libyans. And so the point of that, which isn't made in the case, but which we make as our organization is, even if you're outside the system, which is problematic, including the detention centers, you're still at risk because the public is rejecting of that. And one of the arguments that's being forwarded by the Libyan politicians is, if migrants come in here and they stay long enough and there's no way we can get them out, with time they'll be naturalized and they will become Libyan, and after a few decades we will no longer be an Arab country. So it plays on all the fears that Libyans have. And that creates a fundamental problem because as a migrant you're not safe anywhere. And what we've seen recently actually is a lot of informal, totally illegal detention centers of just people coming together, collecting a few and then selling. There's been really disturbing footage of selling some of these migrants into slavery. And I think all of this is what we need to be considering when we're talking about who is responsible within the Libyan state, but also outside it.
Thank you very much, Ilham. I'm sure we'll have occasion to ask questions after we talk now on our second part of this panel, and quite different aspects, but that we also wanted to address here with regard to Libya, which is the issues of terrorism in Libya and the network that we can identify with this. And for this topic, we have very good expert, Jean-Paul Rouillet, who is indeed an expert on terrorism issues. He worked for the Swiss Federal Office of Police, the FEDPOL, from December 2003 to January 2010, where he created the first counterterrorism unit within the Swiss Federal Criminal Police. And it was in charge of intelligence collection and risk analysis in the field of counterterrorism and terrorism. And he also worked with the Office of the Coordinator of Intelligence Services of Ambassador Jacques Niclou as advisor on Homeland Security. In 2011, he created the Geneva Center for Training and Analysis on Terrorism, and he's also the manager of the Terrorism and Joint Analysis Group at the GCSB. So the floor is yours.
I would like to begin with an experience I made. It was, I think, in 2006, and I was unit chief for the Swiss Federal Police, and I was participating to a conference in Cairo. And it was, of course, about terrorism. And in between two panels, I spoke to one of the guys who was in charge of counterterrorism for Libya. And we had very, very interesting discussions about the Libyans were involved in terrorism in Europe, and as I was coming from Switzerland, we talked a lot about some of the people that he was interested in Switzerland, and I have to admit, people that we also had a very clear interest into in this country, because they belong to one of the major Libyan, let's say, jihadi terrorist organization. And then he closed the discussion, and he went on scene and he took the floor. And as he addressed me bilaterally before, when he was on the scene, he was addressing his Arab partners and not me. And he, on the scene, accused Switzerland of not having done what it should have done against these Libyan terrorists, who had been, of course, mentioned to us via Interpol and other channels. And clearly, the speech he held at the time was absolutely not the one he gave to me when we spoke bilaterally. You want to speak about terrorism in Libya? Good, but do not forget that this is a complex situation with different levels of understanding. And if I ask you what kind of images come to your mind when we speak terrorism in Libya today, I'm sure you will speak to me about the presence of the Islamic State in Libya. Some of you might even think about what just occurred in Manchester with al-Ubaidi, the guy who just, used a bomb. Or maybe some of you, we spoke about Qatar recently, might evoke the name of Abdel Hakim al-Hajj, who, well, by the way, sued the British government for pretty comfortable amounts of money, but who was also involved in some pretty strange activities before. My first point would be to tell you that maybe you know it or maybe you don't. But in the field of jihadism, when you speak Libya, you speak serious people. And their involvement in terrorism did not begin in 2011. If you compare to other African countries, you can say that Libyan groups have followed the same path. First of all, some of the people that will take the scene, I'll mention them later, but some of the major actors in the jihadi scene in Libya are people who, like in Algeria, like in Morocco, like in other countries, were trained by the Muslim Brothers. I'm not saying the Muslim Brotherhood is a terrorist organization, please don't misunderstand me, but in terms of understanding the mechanism of clandestinity, of how to create a cell, how to manage communication in cells and different organizations, they were all, these people, trained by the same organization, Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimin, the Muslim Brotherhood. We're speaking here about the 80s. They were already present in Libya, and they were already under the radar of the Gaddafi regime. The second part of it, if you go back into history, is Afghanistan. The Arab Afghans, when we think about them, we think about Algeria. We think mainly also maybe Tunisia is another option. But basically, the first people you think of are not Libyans. But the truth is that Libya also sent a lot of people to Afghanistan, and they fought alongside the different groups of the resistance at that time against the Soviet Union. And they were the people that were first trained in the arcanes of that kind of guerrilla fighting. And they are the people who came back to Libya in the 90s and who created the different groups that will a bit later merge into the LIFJ, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. Among these people, there were some figures, some people that would a bit later play a leading role on that scene. What is interesting is that in the 90s, in Libya, when it comes to jihadism, like in Algeria or in other countries, the groups were created not to have an international reach or an international action. But these groups were clearly created to dismiss, or let's say, to take the position of the government. In Algeria, the point was really, they tried through elections, it didn't work, they did change their strategy, but the point was really to oust the governments and to create religious, let's say, Islamic State-like government in their countries, but in their countries, it was clearly at that time a national approach. What is interesting with Libya, and that also is emotionally connected to the Gaddafi regime, is that in Libya, the people, the Arab Afghans that returned from Afghanistan, had a really, really hard life. In other words, to survive, just to survive, I'm not speaking here even to be successful, but to survive in Libya, the first members of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group really had to develop strategies, processes, structures that were way above what the others had to do in other countries. What I want to say by that is that if you look at the jihadi scene in the 90s, but also later, till I would say 2010, when you think who were the most professionals, is what? They were Libyans. For us, in the European Security Services, when we thought about the most serious guys, when you were Libyans. The people that were always in the background of all the others, be they Algerian, be they Moroccans, be they Tunisians, you would see the shadow of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. Let me give you just one single example. When Algerians or Tunisians would still try to communicate using telephones or using the internet. In 2008, when the core of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group structure was neutralized, dismantled in the UK, in the United Kingdom, the people, when they decided to transfer that center into Switzerland or to pass the responsibility to people living here, they did not do it using telephones, they did not use the internet or whatsoever, but it was someone who came directly from the UK in Switzerland. They met in a very private premises and he delivered the message orally, directly to these people. There was absolutely no traces of what was said in that specific discussion. It's just a very basic example to tell you how these people work. And this comes from the hard life they had. You know, the prison Abu Slim, I mean, was full of people that belonged to the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. So they fought against the Gaddafi regime. In the 1990s, the goal for them was clearly to oust the government of Gaddafi, but then most of them, for those who had not been, let's say, jailed by Gaddafi, who had not been killed, or those who had not relocated in Europe, they had to go to Afghanistan. They went back to Afghanistan after bin Laden was himself sent out of Sudan, when he was thrown out of Sudan. And by the way, they were Libyans, with Osama bin Laden when he was in Sudan in 1994. And these people went back to Afghanistan, and this is where, with the Tunisian Islamic Fighting Group, with the Moroccan Islamic Fighting Group, this is where all these groups came not under the control, this would be wrong, and especially for the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, but they worked together, they developed a very specific dynamic between their group, the other North African groups, and Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden himself. Maybe some of you have heard about Noman Ben Othman. You know that name? He was a member of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. He now is one of the leading figures of the Killing Foundation in the UK. And if you want to hear someone who can tell you how he worked from the inside and the discussion that occurred in Afghanistan between the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group and Al-Qaeda and other groups, this is the guy you have to question. Because he was part of the people who led these discussions. He now is on the other side, but he was at that time part of the history of the different Libyan fighting groups. You had these people in Afghanistan, and you had, that's the second point I want to mention, the different fighters that were spread. In Northern Africa, if you look back and if you look at the Algerian routes, you will see that there were Libyans among them. You will also see that behind the Moroccan Islamic Fighting Groups and some of the operations that were unleashed in the 2000s by the Moroccan Islamic Fighting Groups in Morocco, you will see that in the background, the people that trained the Moroccan jihadists, you have Libyans. And what was really quite incredible was also to realize that the LIJ, that group, and their different networks has spread throughout the entire world, but mainly, of course, Europe. We, for example, in Switzerland, we had the number 2 of the group. Well, correction, it's not we had, he still is there. We also had the guy, and he still is there, who was in charge of security on behalf of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. Whereas, for example, in the UK, you had some of the people that were in charge of connecting the dot between the different parts of the networks worldwide. These were the people that were in charge of the global structure when the Hajj himself was still, for example, for a moment in Afghanistan, working with them. So the Libyans were the most professionals. They were, in terms of security and processes, the most professional too. And when it came to having the broader reach, they also were the people in charge. What occurred is that after 9/11, this is where things changed. Because some of these people left Afghanistan, Ben Hajj was one of them. I don't know, I mean, you were on the legal side of things, but I think You've seen the documents that Human Rights Watch found in the basement of the Libyan services when they arrived. I mean, this is the rendition of Belhaj, all the program where Belhaj was identified in China, I think it was in Hong Kong if I'm not wrong, and where the British and the American services arranged themselves with the Gaddafi regime to have him sent back to Libya and jailed into Libya. But at the same time, during that period, you had other leading members of the LIFJ who had relocated throughout Europe, throughout other countries. And you also had a portion of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group fighters that pledged allegiance to Al-Qaeda. The first guy after 9/11, the one who was killed in charge of the relocation of Al-Qaeda in the Afghanistan-Pakistan area, was a Libyan. His kunya, his war name was Abu Layth al-Libi. He was the one in charge of the communication between Al-Qaeda and the Pakistani Taliban, or call them the way you want. If you look exactly at the same time, the guy who was in charge of the whole international structure of Al-Qaeda, his name was Abu Faraj al-Libi. As his name says, he was a Libyan. The guy at that time who was in charge of the religious doctrine of Al-Qaeda was a Libyan. It was Abu Yahya. And I can continue like that on and on. I mean, the special forces of Al-Qaeda were under the control of the Libyan. In other words, for the period that goes from 2001 to 2005-6, the major actor inside Al-Qaeda's general staff, to call it like this, were Libyans. For those of you who have had access to the Abbottabad documents that were found in Osama bin Laden's house when he was killed, who was the guy who was his only direct connection with the outside world? Where was he coming from? If I'm telling you his name was Atiyatullah al-Libi, well, you don't need me to tell you where he was from. Again, you have a Libyan who was in charge of that. And guess what? If Afghanistan was a conflict that was closing, when Iraq was invaded by the Americans, when they just decided to destroy Saddam Hussein's regime, as we found in documents that were found, by the way, in Syria, who was one of the major contingents of fighters who was sent to Iraq to fight against the Americans? Where were they coming from? They were coming from Libya. They were coming from cities like Derna, Benghazi, and they were coming from the cities that already were the hotbeds, historically, from the Libyan Islamic fighting groups members. People that were inside of Al-Qaeda were the first generation. The people that were sent to fight against the Americans in Iraq were the second generation. And here there was a change in terms of how many people were sent. According to documents found in Sinjar, in Syria, the percentage of Libyans inside of the whole foreign fighters organization was the second after, I think, if I'm not wrong, the Saudis. But it was the second contingent, and they were the best trained. I can tell you that for us in Europe, when we analyzed the different networks and the structures in Iraq that were connected to Al-Qaeda in Iraq and to the Zarqawi network, they were the people that were in charge of the fighting units, some of the people that were in charge of some of the crossroads where these fighters were then regrouped before being sent to Iraq. The major parts of them, and the most professional ones, were coming from Libya. And here something happened that will have consequences on what happened after. During that period, Libyans, and that was something quite new, Libyans, jihadists, just began to associate themselves with Tunisians. As we have seen in the networks of the time, if the Libyans were on the end, they were providing training to the fighters, were the instructors, the facilitators, the people that were the go-betweens for most of the European fighters when they left Belgium, France, or whatsoever, people that would be, for example, in Beirut, in Lebanon, or that were in Syria at that time. That no matter what happened after, the people that were in these countries and that were in touch with the Libyans in Iraq were Tunisians. There was a very strong connections between these different people. And by the way, you might know that the founder of the Tunisian Islamic Fighting Group was a close friend of Al-Hajj. So these people were all interconnected. When the conflict ended in Iraq, as far as we know, some 70% of the Libyans went back home. So when in 2011, at least from the side of the jihadists, when the civil war began in Libya, these people were home. And by the way, something that might not be known by the general public is the fact that very quickly, when the situation eroded in Libya, Al-Qaeda sent some of its Libyan remaining leaders back to their home country. And these were the people that then, with Al-Hajj, because Al-Hajj was freed after Gaddafi was ousted, these were the people that structured a portion of the jihadi scene in Libya. And what is quite strange here is that if you have these people of the second generation, then some of the third generation developed. I mean, the people who were not trained in Afghanistan, who did not fight in Iraq, but people who really, the young people who came out from the revolution, what occurred in Libya. They are the third generation. And these, for some of them, are the people that will, when the situation in Libya, well, I don't want to say calmed down, but I would say between 2012 and 2013, some of these people were sent, and by the way, Al-Hajj, maybe you will contradict me on that, but Al-Hajj played a role in that for what we know, were sent back via Turkey down to Syria to support the Syrian insurgency. Some of these guys were sent to groups that were not directly connected to Al-Qaeda. But these were the people that, to make a long story short, finally created, for example, a brigade that has been known in Europe as the Al-Batar Brigade. Why do I mention that? Because Al-Batar is the brigade that trained Abdelhamid Abaoud, for those who know that name, the guy from Paris and Brussels. And even more important, the leading figures of the Al-Batar brigades were people that were Libyans, second generation, that belonged to the LIFJ movement, and that came from Europe, for example, from the UK, from Ireland, or from other countries. And these are the people who then became the core of the external operation branch of the Islamic State. And then, in 2014, the Libyans that were part of the Al-Batar brigade are the people who went down back to Libya and who became the core of the local Islamic State branch in Libya. In other words, when it looks like it's something new, what I'll just try now to tell you is that, in fact, there is a continuity here. And the problem we face is that when it comes to Libyans, at least in a jihadist, seen from a jihadist perspective, this guy have been the most efficient in the last 20 years. Wherever we have had to look at them, they were always here, but always in the background. Because I challenge you, if you look at most of the attacks that have been organized in Europe or worldwide, you will not, on the front line, see a lot of Libyans. But let me tell you that in the background, most of the times, you will see their thoughts touch. So that's what I can tell you in introduction about jihadism and Libya.
Before I open the floor, perhaps I have two questions for you. First of all, how do you explain the role of Libya in this presence of all the jihadist groups before and after Gaddafi? And perhaps the second question that I would have is, what is now the objectives of these groups in Libya? Because you said that some of the armed groups had, at least in the beginning, the will to replace the existing government, like in Algeria and in Libya indeed. And now, do we know a bit more, what are their goals, what are their strategies, and even, is there a possibility even to talk to them, like Elham said, some of these groups at least?
Your first question, why were there so many people before and after Gaddafi? I'd say here it was not that much different from what occurred in the other North African countries at the time. I mean, that was really in the continuity of what had developed in Egypt. I'm not even only speaking about the Muslim Brotherhood, but also of different groups that were created later, like Jamaat Islamiyah and other groups. So they were in that continuity, at least before Gaddafi. The difference we can see here is because of the the way the Gaddafi regime crushed these people systematically, they clearly had to organize themselves and to develop, again, processes and structures that were way more sophisticated and more professional than the others. And when they left, I mean, a portion of them left the country, for those who could do that, and they migrated either to Afghanistan or to Europe, you were facing a team, I mean, people that were way better than the others in that perspective. And also something that we should not forget in terms of mental structures, compared to Algerians or others, the Libyans were way more intellectually, way more prepared to fight and to organize themselves than the others. That's something that we've seen throughout history. As for the after Gaddafi, I mean, that's the basic line of jihadism. When you see a gray zone, when you see a place where the state is a failing state of a certain degree, this is where you go. And the problem, and I've not mentioned that yet here, but there is something that is quite clear when you speak about jihadism in Libya, it's that they are also local interests that are at play. I mean, we've forgotten the roles of I've not mentioned the roles of countries like Tunisia, the way the interactions between the groups that are active in Mali, in sub-Saharan Africa, and their role, their implementation in the southern part of Libya, I mean also the connections with other countries, this is part of the game today. And I think today for these groups, at least for the future of jihadism worldwide and in Africa, Libya is the crossroad. And this is going to be the case for both major organizations, be it Al-Qaeda or be it the Islamic State. That's going to be one of the central battleground for the future. That's absolutely clear from what we see from these organizations today.
Okay, so with that, we have about 10 minutes. The two clocks are not giving the same time. So which one should I follow? I will follow this one so that we have 10 minutes for questions. Yes. Should I pass a mic or do you prefer? Okay, so please.
Thank you very much. You were talking about Libyans going to Afghanistan, to Europe. Can you talk a bit about Libyans going south to Nigeria?
Here, first of all, okay, if you're speaking about that, you are, I guess, speaking about what we call the peasant part of Libya. You're speaking about places like Mosul, Gat. That's the southern part of Libya.
And also the south, in Borno.
Okay, but here, who is sending them down? Okay, here you have two trends. Historically, the southern part of Libya has been a place where Al-Qaeda was pretty active, historically. For example, after the fall of the Gaddafi regime, the weapons, some of the weapons that were mentioned, were bought by Al-Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb. I mean, Abdel Hamid Abu Zaid, one of the leading figures of Al-Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb, went up to Libya to buy weapons, so did Muqtab al-Mukhtar, and so did, by the way, via other intermediaries, groups like Boko Haram and other groups that were active in the area. What occurred then is, you are asking me something very specific here, but the point here is that, you know, that the go-between between the Libyan branch of the Islamic State and, for example, Nigeria, is a guy who is, in fact, a Sahrawi. We're speaking about Abu Walid al-Sahrawi, who was a member of, let's say, Al-Qaeda in Mali, who went up to Libya after the French pushed with the Operation Sabal, and who was at the time part of Al-Qaeda himself, and who then made the connection with the Nigerian Boko Haram, and especially with the son of the founding father of Boko Haram, who then became the new province of West Africa for the Islamic State. So the Libyans, the Islamic State members in Libya, have been using sub-Saharan actors to connect themselves with the people in Nigeria. And one of the reasons why they went to Nigeria was because they could not, at that time, when they made that move, they could not yet connect with the people in Somalia. That was the reason, as far as I know, they went down. It was because the strategy has always been for the Islamic State, not only to stay in Libya, but try to go down south.
So you would say that this link is strong or is weak for them?
It's weak. It's weak for the simple reason that someone that Abu al-Sahrawi has other interests. He is, I don't know if you maybe you don't know that, but he's still connected to Mukhtar, or let's say what remains of Mukhtar and Mukhtar's group. He's still on both sides of the coin. And by the way, that question leads me to another point concerning jihad in Africa. I think if there is one day kind of cooperation between the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, it will occur in Africa. Because this is where the lines are not as clear as they might be in Iraq or in Syria. This is the place where in Libya, for example, you know that one of the strongholds of the Islamic State was Sirte, and guess what? In December 2015, the guy who was preaching in one of the Sirte mosques was Mukhtar bin Mukhtar, who belonged to Al-Qaeda. So this is the place where local interests will always be stronger, and they might go over the enmity between Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. So when I say weak, I just mean the alliances could shift very quickly in that region.
Yes.
Thank you very much for a really excellent panel, both of you, I think both speakers. Just for Ilham, if you can give us some, if possible, elements for hope, elements for solution. Where will it come from, and where do you think the international community can help in that regard? You said the solution has to be Libyan, and I agree with you. The solution is Libya, but of course, all of us here can do something. So where are the elements of hope in this regard, and what can we do?
No, you
I think there is hope. Sorry, you always, I guess, fixate on the gloomy in these kinds of sessions, but that was the topic I was given. I think the hope in Libya comes. We see it a lot in the work we do because we work with the grassroots, and so if you look up, it's depressing, but if you look at the population, there's still a lot of hope. I think there is still, maybe if we take a step back, just 2/3 of the Libyan population today was born under Gaddafi. So we really don't know much more than that. And so I think there's a real culture that needs to be changed in how you deal with things and how you solve problems. And so it'll take a lot longer than a few years to change that. And people are finding Gaddafi solutions to their problems because that's what we grew up with. And if you look at Libya's history, everyone keeps talking about the 42 years of Gaddafi, but actually before Gaddafi was a monarchy that was propped up by the international community, and before that was colonialism. So we have no experience of self-governance and no experience of sort of self-identity, really. And so it's going to take us a while to figure out who we are. And I think there needs to be patience with that. But where the hope comes for us is whenever we work with the activists and the lawyers that we work with in Libya who do it for nothing, and put their, or go out there on a daily basis and document things for us, or build cases with us, or the victims of all these awful violations that still find us and still want their voices heard. I think that is a real source of hope. And I sound very much like an NGO worker now, but it really is incredible to see the resilience of people in the face of everything, and which is why I get so much more frustrated when you hear the international community talking about, let's just get this constitution done quickly, because actually that's a lot of what people are putting their hopes on. It's like this, at the end of this, we're going to have a state and a real country that we can be proud of. And if that's sort of rushed because the international community needs to take Libya as done and move on to the next issue, then the price is going to be really, really, really high for that. So what we do as an organization, and that's a way to support the cause, is we do a lot of work with schools, we do a lot of work with universities, we do a lot of work on, indirectly on anti-radicalization because of all the stuff that was discussed by Jean-Paul, is just to really try to counter some of this narrative and to redirect some of the identity crisis that we're seeing in Libya. And if you look at the region in general, in a very simplistic way, I'm not an expert by any means on terrorism, but I am a citizen of the country that suffers from it, is that one of the biggest problems in Libya was that the young people went out to the streets and then they were left out of the process. The Minister for Youth in Libya is in his 50s. And so I think it's that kind of culture where now they're searching for identity, and the only active recruiter for lost young souls is the Islamic State in our region. And so, if you're someone looking for a sense of belonging and a place to serve as as a citizen, there's very few people that are speaking to you about that. So there's groups like ours, but other groups as well that are doing a lot of really great work with youth in Libya, and I'm more than happy to share how you can support the work of organizations like that if you want to. But there is really good, just to give you an idea of before the revolution, it was illegal to be a civil society organization. It was actually punishable. It was capital punishment to set up a human rights organization. That's still on the books, incidentally. That hasn't been removed. And so if we get the wrong government, or one of the governments, they still have the ability to arrest us and put us before sort of a death penalty process. And so I think it's really important to think how brave people are that are working still in those conditions in Libya, given that the law doesn't support them. With all these governments that have come and gone and all the talk of human rights, no one has changed the framework for human rights in Libya or to do the kind of work for it, or the civil society efforts. And so most of the civil society actors in Libya are now in the diaspora, or they're in Tunisia, or to a lesser degree in Egypt, but in Tunisia, Jordan, and Malta, trying to do work at a distance because, if you're in Libya, you're either on a hit list, like myself or my colleagues, or you're dead, or missing. Sorry, that ended negatively. Let's go back to the students. Yeah, so let's flip that sentence and pretend I started with that and ended with this. There's a lot of review work being done.
Thank you so much. Appreciate the panelists for the insights, and I think we have learned a lot during this event. Nicaraguan diplomats. And I would like to touch upon what Mr. Rier said on the implications and the links of the elements and the nature of the conflict before and after 2011. I was reading a report issued by the Common House of the UK's Parliament on 2016, last year, and it basically says in paragraph 38, and I wanted to ask your opinion. We have seen no evidence that the UK government carried out a proper analysis of the nature of the rebellion in Libya, which was basically what you were saying. It said that it could not verify the actual threat to civilians posed by the Gaddafi regime. It selectively took elements of Muammar Gaddafi's rhetoric at face value, and it failed to identify the militant Islamic extremist element in the rebellion. UK strategy was founded on erroneous assumptions and an incomplete understanding of the evidence. What do you have to say about this?
That it's very much depreciative about the way the United Kingdom evaluate the situation in Libya, and that the only word missing in what you have said is cynicism. Because the truth is, if there was one country in Europe who knew the situation in Libya before and during the revolution, it was, and I think it still remains, the United Kingdom. Then it's not my responsibility to comment on their, let's say, assessment. But frankly, I mean, cynicism is the word that first came to my mind when I listened to what you just told me. So did they miss the point as it is mentioned? Frankly, I don't think they missed anything. And the way they want to present it is naturally a totally different question. But missing the point of UK? No, I don't believe that. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much to both speakers. I'm afraid I'm actually going to direct my comment to the legal expertise, as my question is also rather specific. First of all, I'm Farah Hawan. I'm from the Small Arms Survey on Security Assessment for the Africa Project. So that might give you a clue on why my question is so specific. I wonder if you might speak a little bit or give me some insights, perhaps, from your work in Libya over the last few years about how corporate actors or private security companies may be involved in the Libyan context and what the legal implications for that are. Of course, we discuss non-state actors, we discuss armed groups that are either state-backed or not state-backed. But I wonder, with regard to these companies and their training and their assistance and the various other forms of work, of course it's a public setting, but the legal implications of that are of interest to me from an international humanitarian law perspective. So I wonder if you might be able to say a few words.
I really don't know much about the kind of setup within that structure because it's not really the mandate of my organization. But I don't know if Elise has anything to say about that generally. But I'm not trying to. I really don't have a feeling. It's just not within the realm of what we do. So
You haven't come across it at all in the last few years with the armed groups, for example, that you might speak to, or the different government.
we haven't spoken to the armed groups. That was the question I put out.
I'm sorry,
We're trying to figure out whether to speak to them or not.
The different government groups, perhaps.
I really don't have anything to say. I'm really sorry. I really
No,
don't
that's
answer your
fine.
questions.
Thank you.
So any research on this is like.
Yes, definitely, it's needed.
Check back at this space next year.
Another question, I think here in the front.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe a question to Jean-Claude. You described the Libyan so-called terrorist constellation as one of the best ones or most organized, more professional ones. But we don't see anything now. We don't see Libyans really threatening Western Europe. We see the Libyans more focused on Libya and trying to establish bases there. Because if they would, they have a fantastic avenue for creating havoc in Europe is the flux of migrants. It's very easy to infiltrate, migrants become bombs, etc. So, in terms of strategy, do you think they are more focused on Libya and the, let's say, close enemy than to the far enemy?
Thanks for asking the question, Pascal, because that's a point I just forgot when I spoke to you, and I'm looking in the sense of Ilham. Even in terrorism, I think the hope and the future for Libya lies in the fact that Libyans think Libya first. That might be strange, but when it comes to jihadism, even the people that pledge allegiance to Al-Qaeda and to Osama bin Laden, when their first concern always remained Libya. They are the best, that's clear, but the goal of their life has always been, whoever I think of right now, has always been Libya, and Libya first. So it's not that surprising because the far enemy has never been their major concern, which means the people of the LIFJ and the ones who fought in Iraq against the American and the coalition. No, and that's my problem. And that's maybe the first, I think, example of that might be what occurred in Manchester with Al-Abedi. That's the new generation. And that young boy who was, for most of his life, raised in Europe, with it had Libyan roots, might be the manifestation of what we could see in the future. We could see a generation where that Libyan concern might less be at the core of, let's say, the fight of these young people. And for the new generation, the one who fought in 2011, who might now have been under the command of the Islamic State, people in Libya, we have not seen them yet, but we might see them in the future. I spoke about Al-Abedi in Manchester, another very precise example. That doesn't mean that it's going to be a rule. But don't forget that Anis Amri, when he was killed in Italy, in fact, was on his way back to Libya. So does it mean something? I'm not sure yet. Do we need to monitor this and be very careful? The answer is yes, because the new generation might have other concern, and to go into your direction, they might be more concerned by the far enemy than by the near enemy. That's something we really have to take into account and to study very carefully.
Okay, so we have, I think, time for one more question, and then there is a cocktail after, so you can always discuss with something to drink. Yes, Carol.
Elham, well, I say this knowing about transitional justice, but it really appeals to me that you mentioned 2 or 3 times the word transitional justice. How are people relating to that concept in Libya? What do you mean by it? Because, for example, you refer to constitutional reform, which is a guarantee of non-repetition, and you have some objections to it. So I would like you to elaborate a bit more. What do you mean by transitional justice?
I think for a lot of people in Libya, the focus on transitional justice is the transition element, whereas for us, it's the focus on the justice element. I think the transitional shouldn't be a qualification of justice. And that's my sort of normal precedent. It's not some different kind of justice that it needs to be done because we're in transition. But that's kind of what's being sold in Libya. So the concept of amnesties is super popular because it's the sort of kind of quick, let's get this process done quickly. We saw a couple of efforts led by UNSMIL in 2012, 2013 of setting up like a transitional justice law, which was okay, but flawed in one big way that accountability was very, very weak in it. So a lot of it was about reconciliation and some reparations, but very, very little on accountability, which obviously is a really big issue for us. And we see that repeated in like the political agreement and all these conversations. That's a big concern, especially when we talk to people on the ground about what they want. A lot of them talk to us about accountability. On all the witness statements we take, we always have people tick a box at the end of whether they would be happy with reparations alone. Just to get a sense more for our own statistical purposes as opposed to taking it anywhere forward. And I don't think we've ever had a person tick that box in the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of witness statements we've taken, because they have this idea that because Libya is perceived as a rich country, which incidentally it isn't, that they'll be bought off, and that they won't see sort of a genuine understanding of what happened. So for us, I think it's the whole transitional conversation in Libya, like everything else in Libya, is super rushed. And what we need to do is a lot more groundwork and teaching of people about really what that means and what the goals they want out of it is. Because you get people coming from South Africa selling the South African model. It's like a business, it's a real business, the transitional justice field. And you get people from South America coming to sell the South American system. And you can't copy and paste a system. It has to grow. The reason the South African model doesn't work anywhere other than South Africa, and I think that's really important. We don't have a Desmond Tutu to tell us to forgive, we don't have that kind of process. So I think it's really important that people create their own system, but there isn't that breathing space to do that yet. So as a very small organization in our transitional justice program, what we're doing now is saying to people, don't rush it, but let's make sure we don't lose evidence. Let's make sure we don't lose the important facts. So we're trying to collect all the evidence we can, keep it somewhere safe, out of reach of people that might want to do harm to it. And let us build our own system when we get to where we're not undoing just 40 years, we're doing 40 years plus 60 years before that, plus now 6 years after. And I think there is a lot to learn and a lot to do. And it's, the whole kind of speed transformation is really exhausting and really worrying, I think. And just to give you an idea, so we're trying to raise money for our transitional justice program and our litigation program. And we spoke to every possible European state that's invested in Libya and has a budget for Libya. And one phrase that came up time after time after time when we're talking about genuine transitional justice efforts like accountability or documentation. I actually have it as a goal. I won't say which government because then I'll kill all my bridges with this conference. Said justice is not on the agenda for 2017. Don't bother with any EU country. It's not on the agenda for any. Justice is not on the agenda for 2017. You want to talk to us about reconciliation? That's fine. So just do a couple of local level conferences where people from different tribes speak, but no real issues resolved. Or you want to talk to us about de-radicalization? We've got money for that. But accountability, that's too long. It takes too long. It's too much money. We can't commit to it. So all our litigation, all our accountability work has to be done effectively pro bono by our NGO because no one wants to fund it. So if you want to talk about obstacles to transitional justice, aside from the government structures, even at the NGO civil society level, there are fundamental institutional blocks to us doing the work because the international community has no interest in seeing that process.
Well, with that, join me in thanking both our speakers. Thank you.